It's all a lie, Anna said, but her voice sounded uncertain. Suddenly they heard a sound as if someone had approached the hut. Igor and Anna froze, listening. The door slowly opened, and Maxim appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes full of terror. "She's here!" he shouted, and without waiting for an answer, he rushed inside. "Who?" Anna asked, but Maxim only pointed to the door. At that moment they heard a rustle and the shadow appeared again, this time in the doorway. It was huge and seemed alive, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. The friends retreated to the wall in horror. "We have to get out of here," Igor shouted. But when they tried to get out, the door slammed shut, and they found themselves locked in. The shadow was slowly approaching, and each of them felt fear grip their hearts. "This is the end," Anna whispered as the shadow covered them. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. The shadow stopped and seemed to dissolve. Instead of attacking, it turned into a cloud of black smoke that enveloped them but did not cause any harm. "What's going on?" Maxim asked, not believing his eyes. "I don't know," Anna answered, "but it seems it doesn't want to kill us." Suddenly, they heard a voice coming from the cloud of smoke. "You came to my forest, and now you must understand that fear is just an illusion. I'm not angry with you, but you must learn to respect this place." The friends looked at each other, not believing their ears. The shadow continued to speak, and they realized that it was not evil, but something that guarded the forest. "If you want to leave, you will need to pass a test. You must overcome your fears and show that you are worthy of leaving this forest." Gathering their courage, the friends agreed. They began to talk about their fears, about what worried them, and gradually the shadow began to disappear until only a light haze remained. When they finished, the door of the hut opened, and the forest became familiar again. They walked out onto a familiar path and finally saw the light of the moon. "We did it," Igor said, and they all hugged. But when they left the forest, each of them felt that something had changed. They became more confident in themselves, and the fear that once paralyzed them now seemed like just a shadow. From then on, they were no longer afraid of the forest. They realized that fear is not an enemy, but a part of themselves, and only by overcoming it can one become stronger. Only no one ever saw F.E.A.R again. In a small town surrounded by dense forests, there were rumors that something sinister lived in these forests. Locals tried not to go into the forest after sunset, and those who dared often did not return. But for a group of friends, Maxim, Anna, Igor, and F.E.A.R, these were just stories that they happily discussed around the campfire. One warm autumn evening, they decided to spend the night in the forest to check if there really was something scary in it. They packed tents, food, and flashlights, and, laughing, went deep into the forest. Along the way, they discussed what horrors could await them, and each of them added something of their own. "And if we meet a ghost?" F.E.A.R asked jokingly, rolling her eyes. "Or a maniac who lives in the forest and catches tourists?" Igor added, laughing. Maxim, the bravest of them, suggested a contest for the best scary story. They lit a fire and began telling their stories one by one. But soon, talking about ghosts and maniacs began to make them slightly uneasy. The night was getting darker, and the forest around them was filled with strange sounds. When it was Anna's turn, she told a story about how one day a group of teenagers got lost in the forest and came across an old hut. Inside, they found a diary that described the creepy events that had happened to the previous inhabitants. At the end of the story, She added that one of the teenagers had disappeared and was never found. "It's just a fantasy," Maxim said, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. Suddenly, they heard the cracking of branches. Everyone froze, listening. The sound came from the depths of the forest, and soon they saw a shadow slip between the trees. Their hearts began to beat faster. "It's probably just a deer." Igor tried to calm his friends, but his voice was shaking. However, fear began to take hold of them. They decided it was time to go to bed. Everyone climbed into their tent, but sleep would not come. The night dragged on, and each of them listened to the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, a loud scream was heard. Everyone jumped out of the tents and saw F.E.A.R kneeling, pointing into the darkness. I saw him!" she screamed, shaking with fear. "Who?" asked Maxim, trying to hide his own fear. "A shadow! It was huge and moving quickly," F.E.A.R answered, her voice shaking. The friends looked at each other, and horror was visible in their eyes. They decided that it would be best to leave the forest immediately. Quickly gathering their things, they began to move towards the exit, but the forest seemed to have become different. The trees were closer together, and the path they were walking on had disappeared. "We're lost!" Igor screamed in panic. "Don't panic!" Anna tried to calm them down. "Let's just move in one direction." They walked, but the forest became more and more inhospitable. Suddenly, they heard a rustling sound behind them. Turning around, they saw that someone was watching them. It was the same shadow that F.E.A.R had seen. It stood at the edge of the light and seemed to be waiting for them to take the next step. "Run!" Maxim shouted, and they ran in different directions, hoping that this would help them escape from their pursuer. Each of them ran in their own direction, but soon realized that the forest had become even more confusing. They shouted to each other, but the forest absorbed their voices. Soon they lost each other. Maxim, exhausted, stopped and leaned against a tree. He tried to calm his breathing, when suddenly he felt that someone was standing behind him. Turning around, he saw a shadow that was now closer than ever. It had no clear shape, but it emitted a terrible feeling. "Who are you?" Maxim asked, his voice shaking with fear. The shadow did not answer, but took a step forward. Maxim, overcome with panic, rushed to run. He did not know where. As long as it was far away from this creature, he ran until he fell to the ground, tired and scared. At this time, Anna and Igor were also trying to find each other. They shouted the names of their friends, but the forest absorbed their voices. Suddenly, they came across the old hut that Anna had mentioned in her story. They looked at each other and without saying a word decided to go inside. The hut was abandoned and there was complete darkness inside. They turned on the flashlights and began to examine the room. There was an old diary on the table. Opening it, they saw notes about how a group of teenagers who came to the forest disappeared. At the end of the diary was a note about how one of them became part of the forest, and the rest were doomed to wander forever.